I am live on Twitter, YouTube. Appreciate all the archive views I'm getting on YouTube, the new subscribers, and the new followers on Twitter. As I always say, man, it's much appreciated. It doesn't go unnoticed, and I'm humbled that people watch me talk about boxing and read my tweets and like my stuff and retweet my stuff. Very much appreciated. It never goes unnoticed. Very much appreciative of it. And hit that like button as you come in and hit the sub button. And if you were watching in the archive, I read all the comments. Leave a comment below the video. And I wanted to talk about Floyd Mayweather's comments when it came to Sugar Ray Robinson and belts, the amount of belts, watered down belts, interim belts, and putting it in proper perspective, and the lack of people willing to put it into proper perspective for uneducated young boxing fans coming up who are either not at all interested in learning about the history of the sport, or just they don't want to take the time to do it, or whatever it may be. But you need enough people around. Shout out to No Paul. And I should be on El Chile tomorrow. Shout out to El Chile. Go check them out on Chicano Profits channel. I should be on with them, I believe, 1 o'clock Central tomorrow. No Paul can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But there's a lack of people who are educated on the sport who are pushing back on some of these weak, lazy, false narratives. And when you have uneducated boxing fans coming up who have this unwillingness to learn about the sport and the history of it and put stuff into proper perspective, and then you have that mixture of that on top of educated boxing fans who are generally older who refuse to push back on these narratives and properly educate people, it's not good. It's not good for the sport. It's not healthy for the sport. And I'll address that when it comes to Floyd's comments in a minute. First, I wanted to touch on some comments when it came to Lubin and Fundora before I got into the Mayweather topic. And I touched on Twitter. Is the thing, I love many things about Lubin Fundora. And last week I said that it was the fight of the weekend coming up. And it ended up being that because it was a high stakes fight, true toss up fight. Just these guys clashed at the right time. But on top of all of that, on top of it being a fight of the year candidate type fight with Conlon and Wood, it was a fight between two guys who are relatable. I can relate to Erickson Lubin. I can relate to Fundora. And we're getting less and less fighters who are relatable in the sport of boxing. And if you think that's not a problem, I think you're blind. It is a problem. It's one of the several problems we're facing in boxing. You have less fighters who are relatable to working class fans. And the reason being, you have young guys coming up and they're being pampered early on. They're not going through fire. They're getting big paydays on the front end. And they're becoming part-time fighters because of that. So they're making full-time money, part-time fighting. You have a lot of working class boxing fans who are divvying out a lot of money for all these apps. And on top of that, if they want to go to fights, they have to pay $600 for plane tickets. They got to pay $300 a night for hotel tickets. They got to pay $300 for fight tickets. They got to pay $10 for a Bud Light once they get in. And then they're going to see a fighter fight who is a minus 1,000 favorite. On top of that, this guy who is a minus 1,000 favorite may not care enough about you as a boxing fan, as a paying boxing fan, to fight a second time in that calendar year. And that's a problem. More fighters are unrelatable to the working class boxing fan. What's good about Lubin and Fundora is they are relatable. Lubin loses first round to Charlo, 154 Charlo, a couple of years ago, and says after the fight, I'm coming back from this. I'm going to come back from this. And I'm going to be right back in the same spot. So he fights 7 times. He fights against the likes of Gachet, Ishe Smith. Um, I mean, you name them. The top 10 guys at 154. Rosario knocked him out with body shots. He works his way back up to where he's one fight away from getting another shot, possibly at 154 Charlo, if he were to be Castaño for a legit championship. And this is right here. You can relate to guys who are trying but failing. And this guy empties himself and comes that close to beating Lubin and getting back to where he just came from a couple years ago, where he tried and failed and comes up just short, empties himself. It's relatable. It's relatable for a guy to work hard to come back from that huge loss and try to get back to that same spot. And then he loses and you feel empathetic for him, but you feel for that guy because you can relate to him. Fundora, another guy you can relate to, 24 years old, 20 fights in, but he's been put in with a myriad of styles. He's come up the right way. And now in his young career, he's already number 3 in a very good 154-pound division. Unlike 147 and 160 surrounding it, it's a division where guys are willing to mix it up with each other. And now he's number 3, like a legit number 3 in the weight class. And how you can relate to him is you can relate to his dad building a boxing ring in the backyard. Family business, teaching it to his son and his daughter. Coming up in the family business, they keep it in the family. They come up as a family. And you see him celebrating with his sister and his dad. It's relatable. It's relatable. And he went through the fire. So it's good to see relatable fighters go at it. It's good to see. It's becoming extinct in boxing is relatable fighters. And Lubin and Fundora are both relatable. And I wish both of them nothing but the best going forward. Let's get to the Floyd Mayweather comments. Fighthype. Did an interview with Fighthype. And I saw this on Twitter. A couple comments, and they just make my head hurt. It's not that just he makes them, because Floyd knows boxing history. He just does. Roger knew boxing history. Roger was his trainer. Floyd knows what he's talking about. But Floyd says these things because he knows he can get away with them, because nobody's going to give him follow-up questions. Nobody's going to give him any pushback. And then he banks on people, 2 things. Enough fans not educated in the sport coming up, and then the journalists not giving the follow-up questions, and the journalists not pushing back on Floyd at all. And a lot of it has to do with credentials. That's Fighthype. Fighthype's not going to push back on Floyd when it comes to this stuff. Fighthype's not going to push back because they don't want to lose access to Floyd. They don't want to lose access to some of Floyd's fighters. So Fighthype's not going to push back. But it's troubling when you see networks do it. And I'll give you specific examples to start off before I get into the Floyd comments. And I addressed this on the HCP network on the roundtable with Tank Davis. And the thing that was frustrating to me was, I believe it led up to the Matteo Barrios fight. And they're showing the champions at 140. And I'm like, champions, plural. Champions means plural. There are no champions at 140. There is a champion at 140. His name is Josh Taylor. But they show a graphic of Josh Taylor and Tank Davis being champions at 140. This was after the Mario Barrios fight, I believe. Maybe Isaac Cruz. But then they showed another graphic of champions at 135. And I'm looking at it. Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney with his little trinket are the only legit champions you can list at 135. So how is Tank Davis's name and face coming up on the graphic of champions at 135 when he is not a champion at 135? The troubling part about that is it's on Showtime. Steve Farhood does not push back on it. Steve Farhood's the one actually explaining the graphic as Tank being a champion at 135. Al Bernstein's sitting right there. He doesn't push back on it. Abner Morris is sitting right there. He doesn't push back on it. You don't have these guys pushing back. You don't have Timothy Bradley sitting there pushing back on it because Timothy Bradley's not on Showtime, but he's one of the few people who will do it. Malignaggi was one of the few people who would do it, who would call it like he saw it. But this is what I'm talking about, is there are people watching this fight, and you have to assume that the people watching this fight don't know what they're looking at. You have to assume that you have enough young boxing fans out there who can't put this stuff into proper perspective and don't know that Tank Davis has a JV belt and not a varsity belt. They don't know that Tank Davis's belt is not equal to Josh Taylor's belt at 140. They don't know that Tank Davis's belt is not equal to Teofimo Lopez or Devin Haney's belt at 135. So when you put him on the graphic, equating his belt to Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney, it leads to a complex picture that doesn't need to be complex. Simplify it. And it's easy to simplify. You say that is not a real belt. That's a watered down belt. That's a JV belt. That's a belt that we do not recognize as Showtime, but they are going to recognize it as Showtime because Tank Davis is in the main event on their network. So the network is going to push it. But that's when you have to have guys who are not company men who are going to say, I'm sorry, man. Like, I'm not going to give these guys a pass. I'm not going to give Al Bernstein a pass. I'm not going to give Steve Farhood a pass. I'm not going to give Fighthype a pass just because they want credentials. You have to have people in these positions that will call it like they see it. I'm sorry. I've been around these parts long enough to know that this goes on far too much, and it's the reason why these young fans are uneducated. It's a perfect storm of just short bus behavior. A perfect storm of short bus behavior of these young educated boxing fans who are those who know the least know it the loudest, right? And they know it the loudest. And they know all the wrong things the loudest. And then you have the educated people in positions of power who refuse to push back on their false and fake narratives. And Tank Davis was an easy one. Like, that was an easy one to get. And too many people didn't get it. And I pushed it on the roundtable. I said, people need to push back on this stuff. And the response I got from the roundtable resoundingly was, people who know, and people who don't count. But it just doesn't really fly. It doesn't really fly. You need more people out here educating. I don't know. More people in much higher positions of power than me, because I don't have a position of power. But it frustrates me. But getting to Floyd's comments, and this was an easy one, Fighthype, to push back on. But Remy's Canelo's Floyd's accomplished side-by-side tweet was epic. Yeah, I saw that tweet earlier. That was a good tweet. Yo, Calix, no Paul, Remy in the building. And you look related to Tyson Fury. I am not related to Tyson Fury. He could throw me some money, though. But Floyd's comments, Fighthype. He says, he starts it off, if you look nowadays in the top 10, everybody's got a belt now. I never won an interim belt. There's too many belts in the sport of boxing, so boxing is really watered down now. Everybody is a champion. Now, you take that at face value, correct. Floyd is correct. Before we get to his second comment where he completely contradicts himself. But if you take that comment on face value, correct. Floyd is correct. But you got to read the stitches on a fastball. Why is Floyd saying this? Floyd made some comments about Tank Davis in the same interview where he's saying, look at all we've done for Tank. Tank missed weight. I took up for him in the media. I went to the media and said Tank belongs in the top 10 pound for pound. Floyd saying this stuff in the same interview. So when you get to this comment, who is he addressing indirectly? And you gotta realize how Floyd and Tank handle their business. When Floyd and Tank communicate, they're not communicating via text. They're communicating through the media. You saw Tank do that with tweets the past couple of weeks, and you see Floyd doing it in his past few interviews. Floyd and Tank have this Phil Jackson, Kobe Bryant relationship. Remember when Phil used to communicate to Kobe indirectly through the media when he had something he wanted to say to Kobe that he wasn't going to say to Kobe face-to-face, or maybe he was saying to Kobe face-to-face, but Kobe wasn't getting it, according to Phil. And Phil did this with other players. Phil did it with Scottie Pippen. He would do it with Horace Grant. He would do it with Shaq when Shaq wasn't working hard enough. Phil Jackson would communicate with his players through the media. Floyd is communicating with Tank Davis through the media. Floyd is telling Tank what he wants to tell Tank through the media, what he thinks Tank is not getting. So when he says this comment, if you look nowadays in the top 10, everybody's got a belt now. I never won an interim belt. There's too many belts in the sport of boxing, so boxing is really watered down now. Everybody is a champion. Why is Floyd saying that? He's telling Tank indirectly, look at these belts we've gotten you. Look at these easy belts we've gotten you. Look at these JV belts we've gotten you, these Reggie belts, these interim belts, these silver, whatever you want to call them, whatever they're calling them, the watered down belts. Look at these belts we've gotten you. We promoted you as a champion, and you're going to forsake me now? That's what this comment is about, and it has to be. It has to be. And I agree with the comment. It's too watered down, and we'll get into that more in a minute. But is it that much watered down than when Floyd was fighting? No. And Floyd said he wasn't getting interim belts, and I have to agree with him there. But that's what that comment's about. But Floyd comes back with the very next comment at Fighthype, and he says, sometimes they go, Julio Cesar Chavez went 89-0. I beat more champions than he beat in 100 and something fights. Then they talk about Sugar Ray Robinson, and this is when my big ears start to perk up. Then they talk about Sugar Ray Robinson. I beat more champions than Sugar Ray Robinson beat in his illustrious career. And that's when my head starts to hurt. That's when my head starts to hurt. Because there's no pushback from Fighthype. That's one of the issues. Anybody with two brain cells to rub together who knows anything about boxing, I mean, like anything, can pick that comment apart. And first of all, let's talk about how contradictory that is to his first comment when he's talking about boxing being watered down because of all of the belts, more belts than when he was fighting 5 to 10 years ago when he was active. So he talks about how many top 10 fighters have belts now, how watered down it is. But in the very next comment, he ignores the fact that boxing has a trillion more belts when he was competing than it did 50, 60, 70 years ago. And he brings up Sugar Ray Robinson. And this is when you need people who are educated to put this into proper perspective for people who do not know any better. Because these young Floyd fans, what do they do all the time? They talk about, oh, he beat 13 world champions and he defeated 9 former world champions. And good for Floyd. Like, if you're comparing and contrasting him to fighters of his generation, that matters. That is something that you can cite that could matter, right? Like if you're comparing Floyd to Canelo, you put those side to side. Comparing Floyd to Manny. You're comparing Floyd to Juan Manuel Marquez, Eric Morales, Bernard Hopkins, anybody of his era that you're comparing him to, that is something you can cite that matters. But once we're talking about top 100 pound for pound lists all time, I had the Bird Sugar book out, misplaced it. It's probably in the other room, and I could go line by line. But you're talking about, once you get to that territory, you're talking about the top 0.0000001% of fighters that ever competed in the sport throughout its history. So when you're talking about the top 0.000000001% of fighters who ever competed in the sport of boxing in its history, you look for separation, right? These guys better be doing something special to get on that list. And in order to do special stuff, you have to see separation between their peers. So we can compare and contrast Floyd and his championships against current fighters and former fighters with fighters of his generation. But where it does not fly is when you're comparing him to fighters who fought 60, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. Sugar Ray Robinson. Floyd Mayweather competed in the 4-belt era. How many weight classes are there in boxing currently? 17. If we're not counting Bridgerweight, that short bus weight class. And hold on real quick because I got to get my charger out before this laptop goes black. But Floyd, 17 in the 4-belt era, 17 weight classes in Floyd's era, 4 major belts, and then the ring belt on top of that. How many belts is that? 17 times 5, 85. Off the top of my head, 85 belts going around, floating around. That does not count the interim belts, the silver belts, the belts in recess, all the belts going wild. Then you're talking about hundreds of belts, hundreds, just flying around. How many weight classes were there in the Sugar Ray Robinson era? From my knowledge, there were 8. So they were less than half. Unless I'm missing something. Somebody can fact check me on that. 8. How many belts per weight class? Unless I'm missing something, there was 1, right? So you're talking about, if we're just counting the major belts, 85 in the Floyd era, 8 floating around in the Ray Robinson era. So Ray Robinson wins the welterweight championship of the world. The championship of the world. It's it. What champion is Ray Robinson supposed to fight at that point? He has the championship. So how is Ray Robinson going to fight a champion? And this is what I'm talking about, is proper perspective. And Remy fact checked me here and backed me up. 1 per division. So if Ray Robinson has the 1 belt in the division, what other champion is he supposed to fight? He's the guy. He is the champion. What other champion is there for him to fight? How does Ray Robinson get to fighting 22 champions and former champions in his career if he's the only champion? So when Floyd says something like, sometimes they go, Julio Cesar Chavez went 89-0. I beat more champions than he beat in 100 and something fights. Then they talk about Sugar Ray Robinson. I beat more champions than Sugar Ray Robinson beat in his illustrious career. I guess we should just be thankful that Floyd said that Ray Robinson had an illustrious career. But how in the hell is Ray Robinson supposed to fight champions when he is the champion? He's the one champion in the 1-belt era. Who's he supposed to fight? He doesn't have Robert Guerrero floating around there. He doesn't have former champion Andre Berto flying around there that he could fight. He doesn't have Marcos Maidana, who recently lost to Devin Alexander, floating around there, who he can fight twice. He can't pad his record with champions and former champions, watered down champions and watered down championships, because he doesn't have watered down champions and watered down championships to fight. This is what bothers me. And the part that bothers me is the guy at Fighthype who's interviewing him. He could have said, look, Floyd, wait a second. Respectfully, Floyd, because there's a way to do it, right? Like respectfully, so I don't lose my credentials and don't get fired, and Fighthype doesn't lose access to you. Respectfully, Floyd, Ray Robinson fought in the 1-belt era. So if he's the champion, he doesn't have any champions to fight. Correct? But they're not going to do that. It's like the graphic I was talking about earlier on Showtime, right? When Tank Davis is fighting and they're trying to promote him as a champion, the network's trying to push him as a champion in this championship fight, and Steve Farhood and Al Bernstein are sitting there and don't push back on that narrative and don't put that in proper perspective. And this is the perfect storm I talk about. It's uneducated boxing fans who can't put stuff into perspective, and then educated people who refuse to put it into perspective for them, because I don't know why. I mean, it's a myriad of things. They don't want to lose access. They don't want to make the network heads mad. They don't want to lose access to the fighter, according if you're Fighthype. But whatever it is, man, it's nauseating because it's so easy. It's so easy to pick this stuff apart. If you're fighting in the one belt era and you win the one belt available to you, what champion are you supposed to fight? Like Ray Robinson fights at welterweight and he wins the belt. Who else? And then if he moves up to middleweight and wins the one championship, what champion is he supposed to fight at middleweight? And Floyd's doing the math in his head and he's like, I beat way more champions than Ray Robinson. And I did it in way less fights. So I must be better than Ray Robinson. I know that's what the Flomos are doing too. The young Flomos, the Floyd fans. Oh, he beat way more champions than Ray Robinson. He beat way more champions than Julio Cesar Chavez. So he must be way better. They can't put into proper perspective that you compare and contrast fighters from your generation. You can't compare a fighter from the 4-belt era to the fighter of the 1-belt era when it comes to how many champions and former champions they fought, because Ray Robinson, if he's the only champion, he can't fight champions. How do you fight champions if you're the only champion? How? These young Flomos can't do that math, though. And the math ain't mathing. You can't fight champions if you're the only champion. That's all I got to tell them. I mean, and I know why Floyd does this stuff. And Floyd knows. He knows. He knows. He knows what I just told you. But he's going to do it anyway because he knows he can get away with it. He knows Fighthype's not going to push back. He knows when he parades his fighter around as a champion, that Showtime, the network, is going to push Tank as a champion. And guys like Farhood and Bernstein are going to push back on that. And the uneducated are going to stay uneducated. And the educated are going to stay lapdogs. And we're going to continue to have this perfect storm. How in the hell do you fight a champion in the 1-belt era if you're the champion? The only champion. It's already hard enough comparing and contrasting fighters from different generations. And it's the same thing with basketball. Like how do you compare Bill Russell to Shaq? I mean, how do you compare Jordan to Jerry West? How do you compare LeBron to Bird? Just different eras. You can't even put the stats together because LeBron played in a softer era that promoted offensive basketball that Bird did not compete in, or Magic did not compete in, that Jordan did not compete in. If Jordan was playing in today's era, he would have averaged career average over 40 points per game because it would have been easier for him to score. Mayweather was never in an environment where he would have had to have fought Jake LaMotta 6 times. So how do you compare? The only way you can do these lists is if you compare the fighters. First and foremost, you got to take it step by step. You compare the fighters from the same generation. And that's when you're talking about fighting champions and former champions comes into play, because you're comparing them to other fighters of the 4-belt era that you competed against or at least were current with at the same time. So you take that step first, and there are other measuring sticks that you could use. And then you look for separation from those fighters. Because when you're talking about the top 0.00001% of fighters all time, you look for separation. And first you have to look for separation within their generation. And then once you do that, whenever you say, all right, these are the top 5 fighters of this generation, then you start to compare them to the top 5 fighters of this one, this one, this one, this one. But one thing you cannot do is you cannot use a stat like Floyd's trying to use here and get away with, of how many champions and former champions he fought. When Ray Robinson is the only champion in his weight class, and he has no champions to fight that are available to him. I'm sure Ray Robinson would have loved to have fought former champion Andre Berto. I'm sure Ray Robinson would have loved to have fought Robert Guerrero, Marcos Maidana twice, and put that notch under his belt as victories against champions and former champions. It doesn't fly though. It doesn't jive. You can't do it. Floyd is way better than Rob. I mean, it depends on what. How are we comparing that? How are we comparing it? Floyd is way better than Robinson. Based off of what? What are you basing that off of? We certainly can't base it off of how many champions and former champions on a resume. That much I know. That much I know. And what I also know is you can't give back-to-back contradictory quotes. You shouldn't be able to do it and get away with it with a real journalist. You shouldn't be able to say, if you look nowadays in the top 10, everybody's got a belt now. I never won an interim belt. There's too many belts in the sport of boxing, so boxing is really watered down now. Everybody is a champion. Great. Love that comment. I know why you made it. I know you made it because you're trying to get into Tank Davis's head through the media. Your fighter. Like I said, it's the Phil Jackson, Kobe Bryant relationship that Floyd and Tank have with each other, where they communicate with each other subliminally through the media because they can't get through to each other face to face. I know why he said it, but it's still that is a true statement. And what I would love to see Floyd do is try to clean that up, try to use his influence to clean that up, to clean up the belt situation and make it to where it's cleaner and simpler and less belts, like he tried to do with performance enhancing drugs, right? I would love to see that. But then he goes in the very next statement and says, sometimes they go, Julio Cesar Chavez went 89-0. I beat more champions than he beat in 100-something fights. Then they talk about Sugar Ray Robinson. I beat more champions than Sugar Ray Robinson beat in his illustrious career. So Floyd is going to say there's too many belts now than there was when he was competing. And then he's going to say he has more championship fights under his belt, more wins against championship fighters than Ray Robinson, and ignore the fact that there are way more champions. There were way more champions competing in his day than in Ray Robinson's day. And that is not a good thing. That's not a good thing. I'll say it once again. I sound like a broken record, but if there is one belt floating around in 8 weight classes, by the way, Ray Robinson would have loved to have had moved up from welterweight to junior middleweight on his way to middleweight, and then on his way to light heavyweight, move up to super middleweight. I'm sure Ray Robinson would have loved to have all those weight classes floating around, and then all of those trinkets floating around. 17 weight classes, 5 major belts when you're talking about the 4 sanctioning bodies and the ring belt floating around, 85 major belts rather than the 8 that were floating around when he was competing. Participation trophy era that we live in. I'm sure Ray Robinson would have loved to have competed in this era, fought once or twice a year. I agree, because he fought Conor McGregor to be 50-0. Amazing, please. And Floyd's hands may not have held up fighting Jake LaMotta 6 times. But look, man, I have to keep repeating this because people, I hope one of these uneducated Flomo fans stumble upon the channel and learn that if there are 8 weight classes and there's 1 belt per weight class, that's 8 belts floating around out there. It's much harder to get a championship than it is in our day. And how is it that you defeat another champion if there aren't any? If there's 1 belt, if there's 1 championship in your weight class and you won it, how do you compete against any other champions? And if you move up to middleweight and beat the only champion there, and you have the championship, how do you compete against any other champions if you're the only champion? Ray Robinson's GOAT, no doubt, but when you talk skills, you better off comparing Leonard against Floyd. What I'm saying is, look, if you want to compare Leonard to Floyd, and Leonard's right here, and Hagler's right here, the four kings. Leonard fought everybody on this poster: Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, Marvin Hagler. But he fought this guy, Marvin Hagler, and it took him a while to get there. Understandable. And many people thought Marvin Hagler won the fight, and I believe the fight was at a 158 catch weight, all that stuff, but he fought him. So if we're comparing and contrasting Floyd to Ray Leonard, the equivalent would have been Floyd moving up to middleweight and fighting Sergio Martinez. I'd say, even if he would have done it at 155, where Sergio Martinez is on record at the time saying he would have fought Floyd at 155 for the middleweight belt, that would have been the equivalent. And not even an equivalent. I mean, that we're talking about Marvin Hagler here. Nobody's comparing Sergio Martinez to Floyd Mayweather to Marvin Hagler, but he fought Marvin Hagler. So if we're comparing Floyd to Ray Leonard, we got to take that into consideration. Fighthype loves coddling Floyd Mayweather. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Floyd and Leonard's best skills were to wait guys out in their prime. Harder to get titles in the past, harder to be undisputed now. Was better back then. Absolutely. Harder to become undisputed, obviously. 4 belts. It's hard consolidating 4 belts when you got politics in the way. You got many hurdles. You got guys, fighter A ducking fighter B, et cetera, et cetera. But it's impossible to argue that it's better now with all the belts than it was back then with less weight classes, less belts. It was just cleaner. It was easier to follow, especially in a low vibrational society, low vibrational economy that we live in today. You need to dumb things down for people. And you need to educate people when they need to be educated. God bless. I'm out.